Welcome, everybody. So I am Dawn Foster. I am going to talk a little bit today about how you can turn your work in open source into a career so that you can actually get paid for all of that awesome work that you do in open source. If you already have one of those jobs, I'll talk about some other options so that eventually if you wanted to do something else, you could. How many of you have a job where you primarily do work on open source projects? A few. How many of you have had one of those in the past? How many of you would like to have one of those but don't right now? A couple. All right, cool. All right, so I actually ended up working in open source sort of accidentally. So when I was in college, I was at university, I was getting a computer science degree, like most of us did. And one of the university sysadmins was teaching a Unix system administration class. It was my favorite class. I liked it way better than programming. And when I was looking for my first job out of university, I sort of lucked into this junior sysadmin role at a manufacturing company. Now, the thing with manufacturing companies is that they really don't spend money on IT. So most of the tools that I used were open source. I used them primarily because they were free. Now this was a long time ago. So this was the mid-90s. So it was way before you went to just like a project website or something like Red Hat or apt-get with a package manager. And so you didn't want to install some random binary from some FTP server, God knows where. So I was doing things like downloading tarballs of GCC and compiling them from source from places like FTP servers at University of Wisconsin and CERN so that I could, poke through it before installing it. And then a few years later, after I'd actually moved out of a sysadmin role and I was doing more program management, I was at Intel, and this was maybe 2000, 2001. Back when we were trying to get software companies to add support for the upcoming Itanium processors. Does anybody remember those? Not the most successful of Intel's ventures, to say the least. But I was working on a team, and our goal was to get Linux development tools, open source development tools for software developers, get those running really well on Itanium. So that's what we were doing. And they needed someone to look at the Linux developer tools and the open source developer tools. And they looked at me and they said, well, you used to be a Unix sysadmin. That's sort of close to Linux. You know what open source is, which is more than a lot of the people on my team. So here you go. And my job was to figure out which of those open source tools were actually worth spending our time and money to get ready for these awesome, amazing Itanium processors. And so a big part of that was, is there an active community? Are they doing releases? Are there actual users for this project or for this tool? And I started to get more and more fascinated by how these communities worked, because it was pretty interesting. When I first started using open source back when I was a sysadmin, I really honestly had no idea how a bunch of random people threw code together and you ended up with something that actually worked. And not only worked really, really well. And then, once I started looking at it, I figured out that, there are committers, there are maintainers, there's a whole structure behind it. It's just not entirely obvious from the outside. So I started getting more and more fascinated by that, and I started blogging about it, speaking at it at conferences, which led me into my next open source job after Intel, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, obviously not everyone can be lucky enough to accidentally end up in one of these awesome open source jobs. So I'm going to talk about a few other options. And we'll start with why you might want to make a career out of open source. But the bulk of the talk will be just talking about all of the many different ways to get open source to pay your bills, along with examples of real people who have used these career paths that I'm going to talk about, and tips for what you can do to improve your chances of getting one of these without sabotaging your career. And I'll also share some time management tips so that you can hopefully not let this work take over your entire life. Unless you want to, that's cool too. So a lot of my friends are actually people that I've met in open source communities. And one of the cool things is, especially with working in open source, these friends live around the world, which is pretty cool. I was in Prague for a Linux conference a few years ago, And so I decided I was gonna take a little vacation. I hadn't really done much vacationing in Europe at the time. That was before I lived here. And so I decided I was gonna go to Berlin. That was actually my first stop after Prague. So I got here, got to Berlin, and my friend Claudia was hosting some kind of KDE meetup. I don't even use KDE, but I went because she was organizing it. She was a friend of mine that I'd met in some open source stuff, and hung out with a bunch of KDE people on vacation in Berlin, like you do. And then after that, I actually went to Amsterdam and ended up hanging out with a bunch of Postgres people because they were having a conference in town, and a friend of mine was there. So I ended up hanging out there. But I don't know what this says about me, that this is what I do on vacation, but it's nice to have friends that live all over the place. And I've also been surprised at how many times I run across the same people in different projects. A couple of years ago, when I was working at Puppet, I was contacted by someone that I had worked with back when I was working in the OpenFire community, which was a Jabber XMPP server, chat server. And he was using Puppet at the university where he worked. And he was interested in getting a Puppet camp hosted at the university. So he reached out to me, and we ended up working with him, and we ended up doing a Puppet camp at his university, primarily just because he happened to know me from a past project. The picture on this slide is actually a picture from a werewolf game at a MiGo conference a couple of years ago. And I'm still in touch with a lot of these people, and I've found that I do tend to form lasting relationships, like lasting friendships, with people that I spend a lot of time with at conferences. So werewolf, obviously, is one way. How many people play werewolf? Anybody? Okay, a few. I might have cards with me, just in case. So werewolf is one way, but there are also people that I spend time with hanging out over dinner, drinking gin and tonics, whatever, conference activities, spending time with people. And I'm also surprised at how often my work intersects with some of these friends. And we're often in a position to, help each other out some years down the road in some project or activity, which is pretty cool. This is me giving a talk at a MiGo conference in Dublin many years ago, before I lived in the UK. And not everyone who works in open source gets to travel, but I think that we actually do have a lot more opportunities to travel than maybe some of our peers that work on proprietary products. There's a lot of conference travel, so events like PuppetConf when I worked at Puppet. There's OpenStack summits. There's gatherings for developers for just about every open source project you probably participate in. And when I was at Puppet, we did Puppet contributor summits for project developers twice a year. We did one of them in Europe around FOSDEM, and then we did the other one in the US around the main conference. And then we also did 20 to 30 Puppet camps around the world. And these were really great opportunities for me personally, just to meet all of the people that participated in the Puppet community in real life, which was pretty cool. But it also gave me an opportunity to travel to all kinds of places, which was pretty amazing. But part of this is because we are working on open source products or projects, we can talk openly about what it is that we do. We don't have to worry as much about accidentally leaking some big corporate secret. And attending, and especially speaking at conferences, is quite often encouraged by employers, most of the ones that I've worked for anyways, who want people to know about the work that they're doing. It also makes it easier to hire people. And if you work at a big company, there's often a lot of company travel. So when I worked at Intel, they sent me to places like South Korea, Hong Kong, Beijing, to work with other companies that were working on the same open source projects that we were, which was pretty cool. I'm not sure if Superman really counts as a future career, but you never know. Because our work is obviously it's an open, everybody can see it. We have visibility that a lot of people don't have. So when someone's interested in hiring you, they can Google you and see all of your participation in these open source communities, and being able to see actual examples of your work is a lot more useful for hiring managers than a boring, dull resume that everyone has. And also, working in open source allows us to make connections with people who are then hiring from the community. So I think every company that I've worked for in the open source space has hired people out of the community into the company that I worked for. We did that a lot at Intel. So Intel is involved in probably more open source projects than you can possibly imagine. But when I was there, we hired a lot of people to work on things like the Linux kernel. We had, there are other projects like Wayland and some graphics projects, things like that. And so we spent a lot of time hiring, especially committers and maintainers for projects that were interesting to us. Puppet was the same way. So Puppet has also hired a lot of people out of the community. And it's quite nice, not just from the company perspective, being able to hire people out of the community, but as a community member, you've worked with a bunch of people who work at this company, and it gives you a feel for whether or not you would actually want to work there. So, I like the ideals behind open source software. I can have freedom to use it. I can look at all the details to my heart's content. I can make changes to it. I can redistribute it without getting permission from anybody else, which is pretty cool. We have awesome mascots. Penguins are cool. And as a result, I think we do end up with software that is a lot more innovative and interesting in a lot of cases. And we get to, work with collaboratively with a lot of other people. And open source projects, you get to work with all kinds of interesting people. I mean, I think it's pretty cool. And one of the things, it's interesting that especially in open source projects, you're often working side by side. If you work at a company, you're working side by side with a bunch of your competitors. So I used to joke when I was at Puppet that every year around FOSDEM, it was me, my favorite competitors, a few other people, and we all got together and we organized config management camp, and we organized the dev room at FOSDEM for configuration management. So you form and I'm still friends with a lot of people that were big competitors for the company. But it's kind of nice because you get to work with a lot of people, and even though your companies compete in a lot of ways, you still get to work with the people who work for those companies. So I've had dinner with some of those people. It's I don't know, it's pretty cool to get to work with competitors and have like a actual nice relationship with them as opposed to being enemies. All right, so now I'm going to transition into the how piece. So I think starting a new open source project is what a lot of people probably think of when they think about people who've made a career out of open source. But it's also, honestly, probably one of the hardest ways to make a career out of open source. Your options are basically to find a company who's interested enough in the technology to hire you to work on it full time. And that, honestly, is the easy way in this option. The hard way might actually probably be one of the most rewarding ways to make a career out of open source. But it requires building an entire company around the technology. And that can be, frankly, a lot of hard work. It also involves doing a lot of businessy things that to build that company that not every developer wants to do, is capable of doing. A couple of examples. So Linus Torvalds, probably one of the most well-known examples of this type of career. But he's someone who's been hired by organizations to work on Linux full-time. He did that when he was at Transmeta. He does that now at the Linux Foundation. Frank Karliczek, here in the middle, wrote the original OwnCloud code, but he joined up with founders Marcus Rex and Holger Dryoff to help with the business side of the company. So he still, as the CTO, continues to do all of the technology bits, but he has people who help him run the business, and the three of them work together to build the company. Luke Knies, who's the founder of Puppet Labs, he picked the hard way. So he wrote the original code and then founded the company to work, to support his work on the code. And as the CEO of Puppet, not Puppet Labs, he has to focus on both the technological solutions and the business at the same time, which is incredibly difficult. Luckily for me, because I worked there for a couple of years, he's quite good at both sides. But it's a challenge. It's probably one of the harder ways to make a career out of it. Now, participating in open source projects is a much easier path than starting a new project. And this is probably the most common way, I think, to turn your open source work into a job. And most of the companies that I've worked for, like I mentioned earlier, have hired lots of people out of the community. We did that at Intel, Puppet Labs, Drive Software when I worked there. And And this is really one of your best ways to get your foot in the door with an open source job, because your participation in the community helps you learn the skills that you'll need and make the right connections so that you can land that dream job, while also proving publicly that you can actually do that kind of work. Chris Anasek was, he's the first one here, was head of open source at Twitter. He recently joined the Linux Foundation. But he got started on open source by hacking on FreeBSD and Gentoo and started participating in the Gentoo community. And the Linux skills that he learned there and the connections helped him land his first job at IBM. Selena Deckelman here in the middle is currently at Mozilla, and she's pretty well known for the work that she's done on Postgres. In college, some friends taught her how to build a computer from scratch. She installed Linux on it, and within a couple of months, she had a job at the law school at the University of Oregon as a sysadmin. And then not long after that, her boss quit, and so she was in her second year at university, and all of a sudden she was in charge of the law school's computers, which I suppose is a good way to learn quickly. But her active participation, helpful participation in other open source communities, I think has been one of her keys to success with her career. Dirk Hondel is the other one pictured here. He's currently Chief Linux and Open Source Technologist at Intel, so I worked with him for a few years. But he was one of the first kernel developers back in 1991 for the Linux kernel. And then he got involved in X486 and a few other projects. And in the mid-90s, that work on Linux and related technologies turned into a full-time job when he got a job here at SUSE in Germany. Now, just like companies, open source projects need people to do all kinds of different things. You can't really just have developers and hope that all of the other stuff sort of just magically happens. Someone needs to write the blog post, do the documentation, promote the project, and all of those other things that have to happen. Leslie Hawthorne, she's currently at Red Hat. She started her career working at Google as a staffing coordinator. And then she went on to create, I think, the world's first initiative to involve pre-university students in open source software development. And she's been working in open source ever since. Ricky Ensley spent her early years in open source as a managing editor for more sysadmin and Linux magazines than I can even count. I think she worked for Linux magazine there. And she ended up gradually doing more and more community management as a part of her editorial jobs. And then she eventually landed her current gig, which is as community manager for opensource.com at Red Hat. Another good way to start your open source career is to work for a company that does a lot of open source work, even if you're not actually starting in an open source job. This is kind of what Leslie, who I mentioned on the last slide, started as a staffing coordinator. But it happens that Google tends to do a lot of open source stuff, and she ended up in that group. But you can join one of these companies in all kinds of different roles, writer, marketing, system administrator, developer, lawyer, just about anything else. And this is, when I talked about it earlier, this was really how I first turned open source into that accidental full-time job. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Intel was doing a bunch of open source work. I had a manager who thought that would be a fun project for me, and I've been working on open source ever since then. Kim Moyer here worked within OTI, which was acquired by IBM, and shortly after that, she was asked, so would you like to set up some servers for a little open source project called Eclipse? And over a dozen years later, she's still doing open source work as a release engineer at Mozilla currently. Karsten Wade joined VA Linux as a project writer. He moved to Red Hat, again, as a project writer, and later moved into open source project work, contributing to open source projects before it was his full-time job, and also networking, which I'll talk about in a little bit, were what he says were some of the keys to his success. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when I was a sysadmin in a manufacturing company, we used a lot of open source software. Since traditional manufacturing companies don't spend money on IT, these were really the only option for me. So I ended up bringing in a lot of open source tools into that company. Now, Eric Shamau, who I worked with at Puppet Labs, brought open source into an existing job to fill a need. He helped a university move from a whole bunch of Windows and Unix servers to mostly Linux, and that was where he turned working with Linux systems into a full-time job. That was obviously before Puppet. Jeff Lusix, who's a co-founder at Palameda, which is a company focused on application security for open source software, he was working at NASA in the early 90s with a really, really tiny software budget. And he ended up using tools like GCC and others, which were, not just free, but also incredibly powerful tools. Now, some of my most interesting opportunities have actually come about as a result of my writing and speaking. So my first full-time open source community manager gig, where I was just managing the community full-time, sort of landed in my lap when Larry Augustin and I were both speaking at a really small open source event in, I think it was in Portland. And I was talking about open source communities, and he was talking about something else, I think business of open source or something. And he was on the board of a company that was having some pretty serious community crises. And so he actually recruited me into that company to work on the community full-time. So that's how I ended up with kind of that first full-time community management gig, which was interesting. One of my first speaking gigs was actually, or the first big speaking gig, I should say, was at South by Southwest. And I only ended up there because someone who read my blog contacted me out of the blue and says, hey, you don't know me, but I'm putting together this panel of, something to do with open source at South by Southwest, and I want you to be on it. So I was like, well, it's Austin. South by sounds cool. So I went and did it, and it was a lot of fun, and I met some great people that way. And when I do consulting, so I'm consulting now for the Scale Factory. I consulted before. I actually sometimes end up with quite a bit of work from people who've seen me speak at conferences in the past. So when I was doing this before, I remember one example where somebody contacted me and she said, hey, I saw you speak at this conference like 2 years ago, and now my company needs somebody to help them with some community stuff. Can you come do some consulting for us? And that was, like I said, years after I'd actually given that talk. Denise Cooper is the one on this end. She's currently head of open source for PayPal and has done some really interesting work within open source over the years, including creating the open source program office at Sun, and she was an open source strategist at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of all places. I worked with her at Intel, where she was director of something open source related at Intel. But a big part of her success has come from blogging and speaking at conferences on the topic of open source. Stormy Peters, who's the one on this end, she's currently at Mozilla, and she has a similar story. So she co-founded and was later executive director of the GNOME Foundation. And she also founded the open source program office at HP. But a lot of her success comes from speaking at conferences, again, at open source. Ibrahim Haddad, who's the one in the middle here, he's the head of the Open Source Innovation Group at Samsung Research America. And he was at university, and the professor showed up holding a shoebox full of Linux floppies as the first homework assignment. So that was, he said it was November 1994. And January of 1999, he wrote his first Linux journal article. And this is the original picture that went with the article. He refers to that as his Linux guy in a tie pic. I just think it's hilarious. I'm just going to use it everywhere I can. Consulting, this is mostly probably a job strategy for people who are already reasonably well known for their experience working in open source. But it's it can be a great career path if you want a little more flexibility from freelance consulting, or if you want to build a consulting practice that fits your unique skills. This is also the path that I'm currently on. So, full time, I'm a PhD student at the University of Greenwich, studying the Linux kernel community of all things. But consulting allows me to quite a bit of flexibility because I tend to work a lot with clients in the U.S., and so I can do some of that work in the evening, and it doesn't conflict with the university. And so consulting is a pretty pretty nice option if you need some flexibility. So here on this slide, on the end there, we have Christoph Helvig, and his experience with contributing to the Linux kernel and related technologies allows him to do consulting for a pretty wide variety of companies while supporting his snowboarding habit in Austria. Florian Haas, who's the other one on this slide, has years of experience in open source and is an expert in high availability open source solutions, which allowed him to co-found Hastexo to focus on helping customers with open source implementations. Now, when I first did this talk, I did an incredibly unscientific poll and asked people to tell me how they got started working in open source. So I just basically asked people on Twitter and Google+, and the people who replied to me are a lot of the people who ended up in these slides. But in my incredibly unscientific poll, the most common answer was that they got started with documentation. And it is a great way to get started in an open source project, which you can then turn into a career by some of the various other paths that I talked about earlier. And that's typically where I start. If there's an open source project that I'm getting involved in, generally the first thing that I do is fix some little bit of documentation that tripped me up as a new user for a piece of software. Eric Redman, who's the one down on the end, worked at Basho. He's now at Nike, but he wrote documentation and plugins for both of the major open source projects he's been involved in. In one case, working his way up to core committer, and then joining a startup. And in the other case, joining a company to work on the core product. But both cases actually started with him writing documentation. Chris over there, chief trolling officer at NETWAYS, started with documentation, then moved on to release management, submitting patches, doing talks, organizing more conferences than I think I can count. Jeff Rowe, who's the one here on the end, Jeff Rowe Ozier Mixon, he's community manager for Yocto, also got his start in open source with documentation back at Cygnus. Now I'm going to transition to some of the things that you can do to help improve your chances of getting that first job in open source, or improving your chances of getting that next gig. So this is my nice face. See how nice that is? Now this is no surprise, your interactions in the community live forever. You never know when that random person that you're talking to on IRC might have a job for you years in the future, assuming that you treat them well. You also never know when you apply for a job and you send in a resume. You never know when that person that you treated really poorly on IRC is the person who's reviewing those resumes and you didn't even get the interview. Because of some interaction that you had with someone in the past. It's not always possible to be nice to people, but we could certainly try. But I do continue to run into the same people in different communities. And you never know when you might end up, working with or even for the person that you're interacting with online today. I've had cases where people I've worked with in the past all of a sudden have been hired by the company to work in some position that I need to interface with. You never know when that person's going to be hired by somebody in your company and eventually become your manager. So be nice. Avoid those negative interactions with people. Now, networking is also one of the key ways of increasing your chances of being successful. This is true if you're looking for a new job in open source, or any kind of new job, or just making the best of the job that you have right now. When you're looking for a job is not the time to start networking. This needs to be long-term and something you should be doing all the time. It's also not, I repeat, not about being weird and sleazy and exchanging the most business cards, because that's just yucky. And when I think of these activities, honestly, when I think of these activities as networking, I actually hate the word networking. When I think of it as networking, it gets weird and I don't like it and it feels slimy. So I like to think about it as having interesting conversations with people who do things similar to what I do. And I recommend approaching it as that. Don't approach it as networking. Just approach it as having interesting conversations with people that you work with in your industry, or people who work on similar projects, people that you find interesting. If someone's boring you to death, you can make a nice, graceful exit and go talk to someone else whose work is maybe more interesting to you. And personally, I just love hearing stories about what people are working on, how they ended up in open source, and so I don't know. I think it's just kind of fun to talk to people, see what people are working on. Now, once you get that open source gig, that awesome job, one of the tricky things can be that these projects they're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And something is always going on, and they can suck up as much time as you possibly allow them. And finding the right balance between doing as much as you possibly can while not pushing yourself past your limits and getting incredibly burned out is something I struggle with, frankly. I always have. I always want to help out. I want to do everything. I want to make the project successful, but there's only so much I can do before I make myself crazy. So I do try really hard to prioritize my activities, especially when I already feel like I'm starting to get burned out. And I try to be brutal about which tasks I actually need to focus on because they are the most important, but they're not necessarily the ones that someone else thinks are the most urgent. And so that's a hard balance. I also try to delegate a lot. Sometimes this is explicit, like actually just asking them to take over a task. But a lot of times it's actually more subtle than that. So, and especially as a community manager, I often wait to respond to requests and questions in hopes that someone else will respond. This is not just me being lazy. Okay, maybe a little bit, but it has an interesting side effect. Because if you are in a community, especially if you're in some kind of a leadership role, project lead, community lead, something like that, and you're jumping in and you're answering all of the questions, then the expectation in the community is that, Dawn answers the questions. I can't answer a question. And what that actually does is it ends up discouraging other people from asking questions. So waiting gives people kind of the space to respond. And it helps you clear off some of the stuff off of your plate because other people will answer the questions. That's not to say you can't, you should jump in and answer some questions, especially the ones that aren't getting answered. But now most of us fail at documentation at some point or another. I know no one wants to write documentation. It takes all kinds of precious time, but it can actually save you a ton of time in the long run. And documenting those processes and procedures for the project is actually one of the things that makes it way easier to delegate a task to someone else later. Because if you can point them to a document describing exactly what they need to do, someone is a lot more likely to help you with the task. Also, if I've answered the same question or written similar content a couple of times, I always try to make sure that I document it somewhere. And I've actually, over the years, I've had just tons and tons of email templates and canned responses floating around for things like common questions or accepting or rejecting speakers, things like that, asking people to do common tasks. I try to document all of that. Now, I actually take my vacations very seriously. For someone who works as much as I do, I do need some serious downtime. So I try to take one real vacation a year, which usually involves a beach, fruity drinks with lots of alcohol in them, a Kindle full of science fiction books, and really not much else. I actually just did one of these. That's why I look so relaxed. I just did one of these in the Dominican Republic with my mom, and we spent 8 or 9 days just hanging out on a beach in the Dominican Republic with fruity rum drinks and my Kindle. It was awesome. But for these vacations, I do ignore everything. So my work email remains unopened. I try not to think about work. I try not to think about the open source projects I'm involved in. When I was first at Puppet Labs, I was lucky because first at Puppet, it's going to take a long time to break that habit. How many of you know Puppet changed their name? It's no longer Puppet Labs, and now it's just Puppet. Okay. The two guys that do Puppet stuff back here. It's a hard habit to break. But when I worked there, I was lucky because it was really a community full of amazing people. One which makes ignoring it for a week or two and going on vacation a whole lot easier. I was on a vacation in Hawaii over the U.S. Thanksgiving break, and one of the first things I do when I get back is I look at all the mailing list posts, and I look to see which ones had a bunch of replies, because that's, something happened there, I should go look at it. So I was looking down through, and this one thread had a ton of replies. I was like, oh God, what happened here? And so I start looking at it, and it starts with someone asking, admittedly, kind of a stupid question. The next person posted a reply, which was one of those "let me Google that for you" links. And another person said, "Wow, posting that, let me Google that for you" link is a real, quote, dick move. And then, so this, in some communities, this would have spiraled out of control, and somebody would have called my cell phone on vacation, and I would have been most unhappy. But in this case, other people in the community stepped up and said, hey, that's not nice, but you shouldn't call it a dick move. You shouldn't, And it all ended up with everybody apologizing to each other, and then this guy actually getting some useful answers to his question, which was really a pointer to some of the clearly documented things that he was asking about. But it's kind of nice to work in communities like that. Now, I'm a lot more flexible on my other vacations. So the beach vacations I take very seriously. But my other vacations, I try to disengage from things that, to me, feel like work, and only do things that seem like fun. So I might play with some new technology I've been meaning to try, make some contributions to an open source project, write some blog posts, go to a few meetups, especially if I'm in another city. And then I try to make sure that I also take some time every day for fun things that I enjoy doing, just to kind of disengage from work and my other projects. So right now that's mostly reading science fiction, running, playing a few games of Hearthstone. We have a werewolf group in London that meets once a week, which is pretty cool. So the downtime is important. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, as a community manager working in open source communities, I've had honestly just a pretty fantastic opportunity to explore strange new worlds, seek out new life, new civilizations, boldly go where, only some people have gone before. Thank you. We're also hiring. Any questions? All right, I know somebody has a question. I'm just going to stare awkwardly until somebody asks it. It only gets more awkward from here. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps you can start and then you can repeat the question, please.
Yeah.
Where do you see the main differences of things you do for an open source career to things you do for a software career?
So what do I see as the primary differences between things you do for an open source career and things you do for any other proprietary software gig? Honestly, a lot of these suggestions also work for some of the proprietary gigs. I would say the main difference is really just the visibility that you get in an open source project. From a career standpoint, for a lot of people, for people who haven't contributed a lot to open source projects before starting an open source career, people who've worked mostly in proprietary projects who are then kind of thrown into an open source career, tend to, and I struggled with this too when I first started doing it. It's incredibly challenging to get used to participating in the open and doing everything in the open, because it's different when you're in a company, because you submit your code into the local repository and only a couple of people see it. And if you do something really stupid, only a couple of people notice, which is different in the open source careers. I would say that's probably the biggest difference. I would say from a career perspective, as far as getting a job, I think there are actually a lot of similarities. I think the mechanisms are maybe a little bit different because networking and talking to people and meeting people. Honestly, all of my good jobs have come from connections I've had with other people. And that's, that would be true whether it was an open source job or not. But I think with open source jobs, I think that that actual participation that you're doing in the community, I think makes a pretty big difference when you're getting that job. So I think you end up probably knowing the people that you're working with or going to be working with a lot better, which I think is kind of a big advantage. Did that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? People just really want coffee.
We have
They
plenty
really
of
want
time.
that coffee break.